as you were talking about, I thought that the introduction about gathering was really fascinating, actually. And I could see a talk coming on called The Secret of Triratna Gather. And I was thinking, you used the word together a number of times. I don't know if you picked up on that, but together must be connected with the word gather, mustn't it? To gather. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about that today. I expect we're all familiar with the rough outlines of the Buddha's life before enlightenment. You know, born the son of a king, 3 palaces, his father the king not allowing him to go outside the palaces for fear that he'd see unpleasant things which would make him think. But he went anyway with his friend Chanda in the chariot, and he saw an old man, a dead man, an ill man, each of which really upset him and made him think. And then on the 4th occasion they went out and he saw a wandering mendicant, and that made him think. That's what I want to do. And then the leaving home in the middle of the night with Chandana. It's all on the back wall there, isn't it? His whole story is on the back wall, all those pictures, but he's not with Chandana, with Chanda. And there's a lovely picture of him crossing the river with Chanda hanging onto the horse's tail and cutting his hair off and becoming a wanderer, and then finding a teacher, Alara Kalama, then Udaka Ramaputta, neither of which satisfied him, and then the years of ascetic practices, and then realizing that didn't work, and then eventually gaining enlightenment. I expect you all know that. But a lot of that is legendary. What do I mean by legendary? I mean non-canonical. It's not in the Pali Canon, although hints of it are in the Pali Canon, out of which these legends developed. So what I've been doing the last few days is I've been poking around in the Pali Canon, finding the places where the Buddha talks about himself. And he always says this to the monks. Before monks, I was awakened when I was still a bodhisattva, or bodhisatta as the Pali is, but I'll say bodhisattva. Then he tells the story of his time before enlightenment. And you can get a really good picture of the Buddha, what he was like before he was the Buddha, from these stories that the Buddha tells. And they're not just reminiscences. The Buddha isn't just reminiscing just to pass an evening. He's actually making a point with each one of these stories he tells. So what I've done is I'm going to... When you look at these, actually, you really get a sense of the Buddha as a person. The Buddha as a human being, and what he was doing, what he was thinking, how he was acting, how he was feeling even at times. And so what I'm going to do is tell you about some of those stories that the Buddha tells and help you get a picture of what he was like as a person before he became enlightened, when he was still only a bodhisattva. And I'm going to tell you the name of each sutta that I'm talking from, so that if you want to, you can look them up yourself and, read the sources. So the first one is from the Sukhamala Sutta, and the Buddha says, before I was awakened, when I was still a bodhisattva, he said, "Monks," this is when he was still a child, "Monks, I lived in refinement, utmost refinement, total refinement." That's one translation. Another translation have delicate. I lived in delicacy, utmost delicacy, total delicacy. He goes on about this for some time, but for one thing he says is that I used no sandalwood that was not from Varanasi. Only that kind of sandalwood, only the best. My turban was from Varanasi, as were my tunic, my lower garments, and my outer cloak. So this is the place, Varanasi. This is the utmost, best place for these things. And then he says, a white sunshade was held over me day and night to protect me from cold, heat, dust, dirt, and dew. So that's the kind of life he lived. You could say utmost luxury. And then he says, I had 3 palaces, one for the cold season, one for the hot season, one for the rainy season. No doubt the hot season one was far away up in the hills, maybe near Kalimpong, away from the plains, the heat. During the 4 months of the rainy season, when he was holed up inside this palace, I was entertained by minstrels without a single man among them. So all the entertainment was put on by women, probably young, beautiful women, I would imagine. But then, there's a fairly long description of his luxury, but then he says, even though I was endowed with such fortune, such total refinement, the thought occurred to me, when an untaught, run-of-the-mill person, himself subject to aging, not beyond aging, sees another who is aged, he is horrified, humiliated, and disgusted, oblivious to himself that he too is subject to aging, not beyond aging. As I noticed this, the typical young person's intoxication with youth entirely dropped away. Then he says the same thing with, so you've got aging, with illness and with death. So this is the story. So you can see how the idea of the 4 sights came in here, can't you? With the Buddha going out and seeing an old man, seeing an ill man, seeing a dead man, and so on. Actually, the story of the 4 sights, the Buddha tells that story, but not of himself. It's in a late sutta where he's talking about previous Buddhas, and it's Vipassi, the Buddha Vipassi from way, way back, who the story of the 4 sights happens to, not the Buddha himself, our Buddha Shakyamuni. But you can see how the Buddha's thinking about old age, illness, and death, and the intoxications that he can see in youth, health, and life bring about the idea of the 4 sights. So, is there anything else I want to say? No. So that's the Sukhamala Sutta. After that, the Buddha then starts talking about the intoxications of youth, health, and life. I find that really interesting, that if this story is true, he as a young man worked this out, that health, youth, and life were in some way intoxicating to people. And I remember when I was a young man, I think I would say I was intoxicated with my youth. I was also intoxicated with my good looks, as I was then. And I was intoxicated with just being who I was. So it's interesting that the Buddha worked this out for himself, that people could get intoxicated. The word for intoxication is madda, and I think it's connected with our word mad. It's a kind of madness, it's a kind of ridiculous stupidness that we get caught up in. So that's the first thing. And then, of course, there's the Arya Pariyesana Sutta, and this is where the Buddha tells more or less the whole story of his life. Not everything's in the Arya Pariyesana Sutta, but quite a lot is. And what he says to his monks, he starts off by talking about 2 kind of searches that everyone is engaged in. They're either engaged in the ignoble search, the un-Aryan search, or the Aryan search. And first of all, he talks about the ignoble search. What is it? this is where somebody who is himself subject to birth, and of course that means to death as well, seeks happiness in what is likewise subject to birth. Being subject himself to aging, seeks happiness in what is aging. And he goes through a list: birth, aging, illness, death, sorrow, defilement. And he seeks happiness in all those things, even though each one of those things is subject to the same thing as him. So, interestingly, 3 of those things, being subject to aging, being subject to illness, being subject to death, correlate to the 3 intoxications. So perhaps there are other intoxications, but anyway. So what is the noble search? This is where someone, being subject to birth, seeing the drawbacks of birth, seeks the unborn, the unexcelled rest from the yoke, unbinding. This is Thanissaro's translation. If you know Thanissaro, nirvana, he translates nirvana as unbinding. And then he goes through all the others as well. Himself being subject to aging, illness, death, etc. Seeks the unaging, the illness-less, the deathless, the sorrowless, the undefiled, etc. This is the noble search. Now this is remarkable, and I'll just go on to say that he then says, I too, monks, before my awakening, when I was an unawakened bodhisattva, being subject myself to birth, sought what was likewise subject to birth, and so on and so on. So he says that when he was a young man, he did the same thing as everybody else. But then he realised that was not going to lead to happiness in the long term. So he sought out the unborn, etc. Now, this is remarkable because although it's possible, I think, to work out that health, life, and what was the other one? Those 3 intoxications. That are intoxications. You can work that out. You can think that through. You can't work out the unborn, the unaging, the deathless. That doesn't come at the end of a train of thought. That's actually the premise on which thought can be built, but you can't get there through thought. So how did the Buddha get there? How did he suddenly have this idea of the unborn, the unaging, the deathless? Where did that come from? Well, it's impossible to say, obviously. I can't answer that question. But he had it. He felt it. He intuited it. This is what the Dharma is. Later, when he decided to, wondered after his enlightenment, and he thought, I can't teach this, it's too hard. What did he mean? He meant this. How can I teach people about the unborn, the unaging, the deathless? People won't understand it. Because it's really, really hard to, you can't reason your way through it, and you can't talk about it in a reasonable way, because it's beyond reason. It's beyond the sphere of reason. So how did the Buddha have that? Well, we don't know, but he just did. And what's, for me, remarkable about that is that he conceived of something beyond the conditioned, beyond everything that he knew, beyond everything that was around him. He conceived of something other. And I can only think that it was kind of intuitive. In a way, it's faith, it's Shraddha. What do we have faith in? What do we have Shraddha in? The 3 jewels. Well, the 3 jewels weren't around, not as teachings anyway, but it was the Buddha's faith, his going for refuge to the Dharma jewel. That's what this really means. He intuited the Dharma, even though he didn't really know what the Dharma was yet. It was like a prefiguration of his awakening. And this is what makes Buddhism a religion, not a philosophy. Because you can't think yourself to be unborn. It's either something you feel for or not. I was watching an interview with the very well-known secular thinker, Sam Harris a little while ago on YouTube, and the interviewer was saying, well, Sam Harris is, notoriously against religion, and the interviewer was saying, yeah, but how come you were born, you don't have any sense of anything transcendent? And Sam Harris said, well, you're not born with the transcendent. That's something that's instilled into you by your education and your family and so on, which is, I completely disagree with that. And here's an instance of someone who felt it just for himself, out of his own searching mind. He intuited this unborn, unaging, etc. And this is what we go for refuge to. So, that's the Arya Pariyesana Sutta. There's more about that from that later, but there's another text here. Up until now, it's almost like we're looking at a young philosopher who's, really thinking deeply about life and the limitations of life and how to overcome those limitations, really trying to understand. But in this one, you don't get the sense of a philosopher at all. You get the sense of a real person, a human being. It's the Atadanta Sutta from the Sutta Nipata. It's the 4th chapter of the Sutta Nipata, and scholars are unanimous in thinking that this chapter and the one following it, the 5th chapter, are the oldest portions of the Pali Canon, the most ancient portions. So it starts off, this is the Buddha speaking, fear is born from arming oneself. Just see how many people fight. I'll tell you about the dreadful fear that caused me to shake all over. Seeing creatures flopping around like fish in water too shallow, so hostile to one another. Seeing this, I became afraid. This world completely lacks essence. It trembles in all directions. I longed to find myself a place unscathed, but I could not see it. Seeing people locked in conflict, I became completely distraught. But then I discerned here a thorn, hard to see, lodged deep in the heart. It's only when pierced by this thorn that one runs in all directions, so that if that thorn is taken out, one does not run and settles down. I've always felt this text to be really remarkable, actually, because you really get a sense of the Buddha as a person before his enlightenment, and a fragile person too, vulnerable, to use the modern, rather fashionable word, a vulnerable human being. I'll tell you about the dreadful fear that caused me to shake all over. He wasn't just this philosopher in an ivory tower thinking, He was actually frightened. Life frightened him, especially the violence that men and women have. So hostile to one another. Seeing this, I became afraid. Seeing people locked in conflict, I became completely distraught. But then I discerned here a thorn, or some translations have an arrow. This is the arrow, the 2 arrows. Hard to see, lodged deep in the heart. What is that thorn? It's the thorn of self, isn't it? It's the thorn of self-cherishing, in a way individualism, if you like. It's only when pierced by this thorn that one runs in all directions, so that if that thorn is taken out, one does not run and settles down. So here's another very interesting motivation for the Buddha's life, for the Buddha trying to gain enlightenment. He was scared. He was scared of what people can do to each other. He must have seen it. So he can't have been that coddled away in a palace. He must have seen people doing this to each other for him to be so scared. And of course, we know. It's blimmin' obvious, isn't it? You just look at the news or listen to the news, and again there's been a bomb, again someone has shot somebody, again someone has killed his children and then committed suicide. It's really frightening. The world is a really frightening place, more so now, I would say, than it was in the Buddha's day. So seeing this, obviously, this is what caused him to want to live the spiritual life. And then he went forth. So the Buddha doesn't talk about leaving in the night, leaving his wife and child, sleeping and going off with Chandana. What he says in the Arya Pariyesana Sutta is very, very simple. So, at a later time, while still young, a black-haired young man endowed with the blessings of youth in the first stage of life, and while my parents, unwilling, were crying with tears streaming down their faces, I shaved off my hair and beard, put on the ochre robe, and went forth from home life into homelessness. Very simple. That's all he says. That's what he did. And you can see how the whole myth, the legend of leaving at night came about. There's nothing about him having a child, actually. There is a school of thought that thinks he didn't actually have a child and a wife. He just left home. But we don't really know. So I think you know the next part of the story. Off he went. He went as a homeless wanderer, and first thing he did is he sought out a teacher. He knew that he needed a teacher to help him. So he found Alara Kalama, and you know the story, I'm sure. So what happens is Alara Kalama is a great meditation teacher. And the Buddha asked him, can I become a disciple of yours? He said, yes, you can join my community. And after a while, the Buddha says, it's very interesting what he says actually. It was not long before I quickly learned the doctrine of Alara Kalama. As far as mere lip reciting and repetition, I could speak the words of knowledge, the words of the elders, and I could affirm that I knew and saw, I along with others in the community. So he learnt the teaching off by heart. But then what happened is he thought, I'm not satisfied with just knowing the teaching off by heart. I want to attain what Alara Kalama has attained. And what had Alara Kalama attained? Well, he'd attained a meditation state called the sphere of nothingness. So the Buddha made efforts, he strove to have that realization, and he had that realization after some time. And he went to Alara Kalama and said, have you had this experience? Alara Kalama said, yeah, that's the experience of no-thingness. And the Buddha said, well, I've had that too. So Alara Kalama has a conversation with him about it, and he believes him. Alara Kalama believes that the Buddha attained what he had attained. And very, very generous, he said, oh, well, as you've attained what I've attained, then why don't you come and join me and we can co-lead this community together? Amazing. And the Buddha thinks about it and then he says, no. He declines that offer, generous though it was. He says, this Dharma that I've learnt from Alara Kalama does not lead to disenchantment, to dispassion, to cessation, to stilling, to direct knowledge, to awakening, but only to reappearance in the dimension of nothingness. So, unsatisfied with that teaching, I left. Unsatisfied with that teaching. At the time, he could have been probably a famous teacher. he had this community of people around him, and he was respected and looked up to. He was given this great honour by Alama Kalama, and he said, no, there's further to go. He was dissatisfied with where he'd got to so far. So I'm not underlining these points, but you learn a lot about the Buddha by, thinking about these things. So then you know the next bit, or you think you know the next bit, or at least I thought I knew the next bit, but I realised in reading the text properly that I had misunderstood the next bit. So the next bit is he leaves the Lama Kalama, he tries to find another teacher who can take him further, and he finds Uddaka Ramaputta. And Uddaka Ramaputta has realised the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. It's further on stage. So the Buddha goes, and same thing happens with him, except Uddaka Ramaputta has not realised the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. He's only teaching it. It's his father, Rama, who realised it. And Uddaka Ramaputta is teaching his father's doctrine. He hasn't got there yet. Rama has died. So the conversation, what the Buddha does is he says, I think I'll try to experience what Rama had experienced. So he did. Through meditation, he realised the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. So he went to Uddaka Ramaputta and he said, your dad, Rama, did he experience this? And he said, yeah, that's what he experienced. And the Buddha said, well, I've experienced that too. So Uddaka Ramaputta says, oh, well, you've experienced what my father, Rama, has experienced. So why don't you lead the community now? This is what surprised me when I read carefully. It's not that he says we can co-lead the community. He hands over the leading of the community to the Buddha. So the Buddha could have his own community now if he wanted to. But the same thing. He reflected on that and he thought, no, I am not satisfied with this level. There's further to go. So he left. So, and then, supposed to be using my notes, but I've kind of forgotten all about them. Where are we? Yeah, page 2. Halfway through page 2. So then, what happens then is he decides to try out what I call the ascetic practices, the extreme self-mortification. And he does this for years. I'm sure you know something about them, but just in case you don't, the Buddha spells it out on at least 2 occasions. For instance, in the Maha Sihanada Sutta, he's talking to Shariputra and he says, such was my asceticism, Shariputra, that I went naked, rejecting conventions, licking my hands, not coming when asked, not stopping when asked. I did not accept food brought or food specially made or an invitation to a meal. I was an eater of greens or millet or wild grass or hide parings or moss or rice bran or rice scum or sesamum flour or grass or cow dung. I lived on forest roots and fruits. I fed on fallen fruits. I pulled out hair and beard, pursuing the practice of pulling out hair and beard. I was one who stood continuously, rejecting seats. I squatted continuously, devoted to maintaining the squatting position. I used a mattress of spikes. I made a mattresses of spikes for my bed. Here's a lovely little bit here. Really, you get a sense of what it must have been like to be him doing this. I would make my bed in a charnel ground with the bones of the dead for a pillow. And cowherd boys came up and spat on me, urinated on me, threw dirt at me, and poked sticks into my ears. Yet I do not recall that I ever aroused an evil mind of hate against them. Such was my abiding in equanimity. When I read that, I was thinking of that line from the Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara towards the end when he says, may beings make fun of me. Can you remember how it goes? He gives himself to the world. He gives himself to the world so that people can do with my body just as you want to. Play with my body, do what you want. I definitely get that impression from here. Such was my scrupulousness, Shariputra, that I was always mindful in stepping forwards and stepping backwards. I was full of pity even for the beings in a drop of water. Thus, let me not hurt the tiny creatures in the crevices of the ground. Such was my scrupulousness. I wonder if he was, if some of his teachers at that time were the Jains, who were very, very scrupulous about that kind of thing. Moving to another sutta, the Mahasachika Sutta. This is another one where the Buddha tells the story of his life. He says of this time, clenching my teeth and pressing my tongue against the roof of my mouth, I beat down, constrained, and crushed my mind with my mind. As I did so, sweat poured from my armpits. And although tireless persistence was aroused in me, and unmuddled mindfulness established, my body was aroused and uncalm because of the painful exertion. That's really quite something, isn't it? I beat down, constrained, and crushed my mind with my mind, almost as if his mind was an enemy to be beaten, to be crushed. Anyway, towards the end of it, we don't know how long that lasted. I mean, the tradition has it was 6 years, but it could have been longer, it could have been shorter. We don't know. The Buddha doesn't say how long it went on for, but it must have been some time. At the end of it, he says, I thought, but with this racking practice of austerities, I haven't attained any superior human state, any distinction in knowledge or vision worthy of the noble ones. Could there be another path to awakening? And then comes that lovely memory he had at the end of this terrible time. It sounds awful, doesn't it? At the end of this time, and exhausted and ill, probably lying on the ground thinking this is getting me absolutely nowhere. He remembered, a spontaneous memory came back, and it's not quite as we know it. The usual memory is he's watching his father plough a field, isn't he? Well, it doesn't say that. The Buddha doesn't say that. What he says is this: I recalled once when my father was occupied or working. So it doesn't say that he's watching his father working, but the sense you get that his father was occupied doing something, leaving him to himself, leaving his mind to roam. I recalled when my father was occupied and I was sitting in the cool shade of a rose apple tree. He had this spontaneous experience which, the way he describes it, looks very much like the first jhana. So he remembered that, this lovely, gorgeous, tranquil, fulfilling experience of doing nothing. He's got nothing to do, his dad's doing something else. Maybe he was nearby, but he was just, mind was wandering, and he spontaneously entered into the first jhana. And then he thought, maybe this is the path to awakening. And then he thought, so why am I afraid of the pleasure that has nothing to do with sensuality, nothing to do with unskillful mental states? Up until that time, he'd assumed, along with his teachers and so on, that pleasure was something to be avoided. all pleasure was to be avoided because it was a trap. And that's hence the ascetic practices. You're crushing the mind with the mind. You're crushing out any sense of pleasure. You do that and then you gain enlightenment. But the Buddha, from his own experience, realized that didn't work. At least it didn't work for him. And then he thought, there's another kind of pleasure, a pleasure that is not tainted with craving, the jhanas. And so then he started to eat again, and he got himself well. Must have taken a long time, I would think, to get himself back together. And then he began to meditate, and he got into first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana, and the rest is history, as we say. He gained enlightenment. So, that's the story of the Buddha up to his enlightenment. But I've missed a couple of things out, which I just want to tell you. There's another sutta called the Bhaya-bhairava Sutta. Bhaya-bhairava means something like fear and dread, or fear and terror. And he says, before my awakening, when I was still an unawakened bodhisattva, the thought occurred to me, it's not easy to endure isolated forest or wilderness dwelling. It's not easy to maintain seclusion, not easy to enjoy being alone. The forests plunder the mind of a monk who has not attained concentration. Another translation says the forest makes you mad, makes you go mad. So, what did he do? He thought, I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to go into the forest, and I'm going to go into a place where I'm going to feel fear and terror. And he brought that upon himself. And he says, that's what he did. I stayed in the sort of places that are awe-inspiring and make your hair stand on end. And while I was staying there, a wild animal would come, or a peacock would make a twig fall, or wind would rustle the fallen leaves. Have you ever been on a solitary retreat? If you've ever done a solitary retreat out somewhere far from anyone else, in a little hut or a caravan, this is exactly what happens. You hear a little noise outside, a twig falling, or maybe a squirrel scampers across the roof of your caravan, and fear and terror just arise within you. What's that? Because you're all alone. You've got no protection. You can't call the police. It's like the mad axeman's going to come through the window. Anyway, that's what happened to the Buddha. The thought would occur to me, is that fear and terror coming? And then he says, what if I, in whatever state I'm in, when fear and terror come to me, was to subdue that fear and terror in that very state? So, there are the four postures. There's walking, standing, sitting, and lying down. And the Buddha said that when he was walking up and down, if fear and terror rose in him, he made himself just carry on walking up and down and feel the fear and terror until it subsided. Same when he was lying down and so on. He didn't get up and look around. He just stayed lying down, felt the fear and terror until it subsided. And this is what he found, that if he just felt the fear, it would eventually subside. So this is very interesting, that he was interested in this state of fear. You remember the Atadanda Sutta where he was really frightened, so it must have been an issue for him, fear and terror. So he decided to just be with it and just be mindful of it, I suppose, as we would say. And then there's another one, nearly the final sutta that I want to talk about, is the Dvaita Vitakka Sutta, the two kinds of thought. Again, monks, before my self-awakening, when I was still just an awakened bodhisattva, this thought occurred to me. And he talks about two kinds of thought. He divided his thoughts into two kinds, what we would now call skillful thoughts and unskillful thoughts. The unskillful thoughts were thoughts that were imbued with greed, hatred and cruelty, and the skillful thoughts were the opposites of those. And he divided his thoughts into two in that way, skillful and unskillful, and he watched himself. He watched what happens when he had unskillful thoughts. He realized that brought about unhappiness for himself and the people around him, because it spilled out onto them, and he saw that himself. Again, this is him as a kind of philosopher, isn't it? He realized that happened, or maybe a psychologist. And then he watched himself, what happened when he had skillful thoughts. And whenever he had a skillful thought, he became happy. So he worked that out for himself before he gained enlightenment. Then he worked something else out as well. He said, so he stopped getting into unskillful thoughts, because that led nowhere good. So then he only had skillful thoughts. Then he worked out that even when he had skillful thoughts, he became tired. Even thinking skillful thoughts was tiring to him. And then when he became tired, he sat down and brought his mind to singleness. In other words, he stopped thinking and he just meditated. And in that way, he learned a lot about his own thinking process. And a lot of the teaching that we're familiar with now comes from his own realizations before he was the Buddha. Okay, now there's one more sutta that I just want to mention to you before I end. This is the Nagara Sutta, and it starts again, monks before my awakening, etc., etc. And he talks about this realization came to me, how this world has fallen on difficulty. It is born, it ages, it dies, it falls away and re-arises, but it does not discern the escape from this suffering, from this aging and death. Oh, when will it discern the escape from this stress, etc., etc.? So that's what he says, and then he tells the story of his whole story of his life and his awakening. But then, after he tells the story of his awakening, he then says something else which is really interesting. He says, it is just as if a man travelling along a wilderness track were to see an ancient path, an ancient road, travelled by people of former times. He would follow it. Following it, he would see an ancient city, an ancient capital, inhabited by people of former times, complete with parks, groves and ponds, walled, delightful. He would go to address the king or the king's minister, saying, Sir, you should know that while travelling along a wilderness track, I saw an ancient path, etc., etc. In the same way, he says, I saw an ancient path, an ancient road, travelled by the rightly self-awakened ones of former times. And then he starts talking about the path leading to this ancient city. So I just wanted to mention that because up until now, everything that the Buddha said has been rather negative, as it were. He's trying to escape from samsara, aging, birth, death, sorrow, illness, etc., etc. He's trying to get away from that to the unborn, the unaging. But even that is talked about in negative terms, the unborn, the unaging. But here he talks about it in really positive terms. It's like an ancient city that's well worth going to. So, final. Hopefully we're a little bit closer to what the Buddha, before the Buddha, was like, what he was like as a person. Here's some things that occurred to me. He was very thoughtful. He was very reflective. He didn't just have experiences. He didn't just take for granted the things that are around him. He thought about them. He reflected about them quite deeply. And then he didn't just think, he acted on his conclusions. He came to a conclusion and then did something. He acted on his conclusions too. And then he was committed, really committed. Obviously he was prepared to do anything to reach the goal that he'd intuited, the goal of the unborn or the ancient city. he was also willing to admit mistakes that he'd made and change direction. I mean, that whole thing with the years of ascetic practices was a wrong track. He was going down the wrong track. He wasn't going to the ancient city, he was going somewhere else, and it lasted a long time. It must have been difficult for him to realise, to admit to himself that years of his life had been taken up going in the wrong direction. But he did. He said, no, this is wrong. I'm going in the wrong direction. And then, of course, he was courageous. Courage being not fearlessness, but the ability to feel fear and terror and do it anyway, as the book has it. Feel the fear and do it anyway. That's what courage really is. Courage is not fearlessness. Courage is feeling fear, but overcoming that fear. So he was very courageous. And finally, he had a very strong sense of, the only word I can think of is the transcendental. A very strong sense of otherness, a very strong sense of, well, what we might call the Dharma, the depths of the Dharma, the unborn, the unaging and so on, the deathless. A very strong sense of that. Even though he wasn't taught that, he felt that, he intuited that there was something there. Going back to that final sutta, the Nagara Sutta, when the Buddha tells the monks about the ancient city and the path, and he says, here's the path, and he says, don't let it be a cause for regret that you didn't follow the ancient path to the ancient city when I told you how to go along the ancient path. Don't let that be a cause for regret to you later on when you didn't follow it. And now the book of questions. In fact, I have 5 questions, which is too many. Because I don't want you to sort of skip from one question to another trying to get through them all. But what I'd like the leaders of the groups to do is write down the questions, and then in your groups you can decide which ones you want to explore. And they're exploratory questions, they don't have a yes or no answer. So, leaders of groups. First of all, I'm going to give a kind of lead up, a preamble to the question. So don't write, I'll tell you when you should write the question down, because you don't want to write with preamble. You'll have reams of stuff to write. So first question. In the Sukhamala Sutta, the Buddha talks of the 3 intoxications: health, youth, and life. Here's the question. What are your particular intoxications? What are your particular intoxications? Here are some possibilities. Possessions, and especially for men, gadgets, smartphones, iPads, etc., etc. Are you intoxicated with something like that? Don't say you're not. Sex, for those of you still young enough to be bothered about that kind of thing. Drugs, I don't know if any of you take recreational drugs. Good looks, I'm just looking around. Yeah, I think there are 1 or 2 of you who might be intoxicated by your good looks. Falling in love. Do you like falling in love? Do you get intoxicated with another person? Okay, that's the first question. Second question, and again, here's the preamble, don't write anything down yet. In the Arya Pariyasana Sutta, the Buddha says that he found no satisfaction in, or he was dissatisfied with the experiences that he'd had with Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta. Dissatisfied actually is anala, which means not enough, insufficient. He felt that where he got up to at that point was not enough, it was insufficient for him. So here's the question. Do you have a sense of dissatisfaction with where you're at the moment? Subsidiary question, if you want to, how might you cultivate that sense of dissatisfaction? Three. Here's the preamble. Some of you are still writing. Shall I wait for you? They're still writing. Okay, number 3. In the Mahasachika Sutta, the Buddha relates to Sachika how in his ascetic practices he beat down, constrained, and crushed his mind with his mind. Here's the question. Is there any way or ways in which you are beating down, constraining, or crushing your mind with your mind in your practice? Is there any sense in which you're treating yourself as the enemy to be overcome? Fourth question. Here's the preamble. The traditional accounts have the Buddha fleeing from samsara and are predominantly negative. However, he is also striving for the goal, the unborn, etc. And in the Nagara Sutta you get this idea of the ancient city. Bhante has said that you can either walk away from samsara, as it were, walking backwards away from samsara, and bump into nirvana almost by accident, or you can actively be you can be inspired and drawn towards nirvana. You're not that bothered about samsara, but you're more interested in nirvana, in which case you're running to nirvana and, as it were, accidentally leaving samsara behind. So here's the question. Which way round is it for you? Are you running away from samsara, or are you running to nirvana? You might be both, of course. Subsidiary question. What is your equivalent of the ancient city, if you are trying to get to this wonderful nirvana? What is the ancient city? What does it look like to you, nirvana? What draws you to it? And I'm going to go straight into the question with number 5. Here's the question. Do you have sources of untainted pleasure? That is, pleasure that doesn't cause craving to arise. Something I forgot to say in my talk, actually, so I'll say it now, is that Bhante has talked about using an idea from Freud, the pleasure principle and the reality principle, and he's changed it a bit for his own purposes, but he says you need both in the spiritual life. The reality principle is important because the reality principle means that you're trying to find out what things really are. You really want to know, you really want to understand. The pleasure principle is you've got to find pleasure in the spiritual life, otherwise you'll give up. It has to be pleasurable. So, do you have sources of untainted pleasure in your life? Now, for the Buddha, it was the jhanas. It might be that you find it very difficult to get into jhanas. And Bhante's talked about the pleasure of nature and the pleasure of art, neither of which cause you to crave. So have a think about that. So, as I say, 5 questions. There are probably too many questions for us to get through. So, in your groups, choose which ones you want to have a look at. We've got plenty of time. Okay.